Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Lamed Tes in Avodah Zarah. We learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and soon about Sarah B'Shivya. We'll start with the bottom of Lamed Ches and base, 3 lines from the bottom of the page. The Mishnah had said, Mishnah's talk about things that you're not allowed to eat. You could have a gnaw from them, but you can't eat them. And presumably because they weren't really used for Avodah Zarah. Question is, they're kosher or not? Or there's less of a chance of them putting in yayin nesach there. So one of the things was kvoshin shedarkon losses betocha yayin. We said things that the minig is that, or the minig, the custom, I wouldn't call that a minig, that they would put pickled foods that they could have put wine in there. Mishnah had said. So it was, what Mishnah said at the bottom. This is on Mishnah Lamed Hayomi Beis. If it was pickled stuff that when they pickled the foods, vegetables, whatever it were, they would put in wine and vinegar. So there's a concern that maybe they put in their yayin nesach or their chometz or their vinegar, which could have been old wine. There was a concern. But you know what? If you don't know for sure that they did it, you can't eat it, but you could have a gnaw from it. You could sell it, do business with it. So Omar Chizkiah, so Chizkiah makes a qualification. Omar Chizkiah, 3 lines from the bottom of the page. Omar Chizkiah, it's only if the minig was, they usually put wine or something, wine or vinegar in there. Abul biyadu, if you know for sure they put wine or vinegar into the pickled item, then also I feel you can't even have a gnaw, probably because it could be yayin nesach. The Gemara says, "Umayshna min murayis." What about fish sauce? The shor rabbanan b'hano. There in the previous Mishnah, Chavtes and Beis, where we talked about things that you can't have hano from. There, Rav Meir said you can't have even hano from fish brine because they put wine, fish sauce because they put wine in there. And the rabbanan say you're allowed to have hano from there. So why do you say, even though the fish brine they definitely put wine in, and here they don't? So here you don't know for sure. Here, in other words, Chizkiah says that if you know they put wine in there, you can't even have hano. How is it different than fish sauce, where you know they put wine in, and you could have hano there, according to the rabbis back on Chavtes? It's Hasam Laborizuma. There, the wine is simply to get rid of the smell of the fish, to get rid of the bad taste or the smell, right? The zihum. But over here, it's to give it a good taste. In other words, if you know for sure that they put wine into this pickled concoction, then according to Chizkiah, you cannot even have hano from it because it's adding to the taste. Rabbi Yochanan says exactly the opposite of Chizkiah. Even if you know for sure they put the wine into the pickling jar, it's still mutter. So now Kash is, how is that different Marias according to Rav Meir? The Marias back on Chavtes and Beis, where we talk about the fish sauce. Rav Meir says you can't have enough from it because they definitely put in yayin nesach in there. How is it different here? Rabbi Yochanan says even if you know they put a wine in, it's also mutter. And Rav Meir says the opposite, that it's asur b'hanoah by Marias. Gemara says hasam yediyah mamashu. There in the Marias and the fish sauce, when you dip in your bread or whatever into the fish sauce as a condiment, you're definitely eating it. You're taking it as a substance. You're dipping it into the fish sauce, and you're eating the wine with the fish sauce. But over here, you don't really feel it. Meaning over here, when you're pickling it, you're not really drinking the wine. You're drinking whatever you're pickling. Let's say you're pickling cucumbers or some other item or meat. Whatever it is, you're eating the meat or the cucumbers. You're not really intending on eating the liquid. Therefore, he says over here you can't eat it, but you could have hano. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Even if you know they put wine in there, you could have enough from it. You can't eat it. Eating it, you shouldn't eat it in any case because there could be yayin in there. The Torah's trufa. Then we said, "B'tzir she'em badaga." So he said, let's say you have Torah's trufa. Torah's trufa is like chopped herring. Taurus is a kind of a fish. Some say it's herring. Some say just what do you don't know what it is. But let's say it's like chopped herring. B'tzir she'em badaga kilbas, or the fish sauce that doesn't have a kilbas fish in it. Kilbas fish is a kosher fish, and if it doesn't have a kosher fish in that sauce, you can assume in that body of liquid, whatever it was, if it doesn't have a kosher fish in there, you must assume that it's non-kosher. So these things you can have enough from it, but you can't eat it. Again, chopped herring, because you don't know if it's a kosher herring or some other non-kosher fish. If it's chopped up, you can't tell. And then the Mishnah says, again, we're talking about things that you can't eat, even though you could have enough. So it said taurus trufa, like chopped herring, sir shem badaga, or fish sauce that there's no kosher fish floating in there, shotet smoke. The hachilik, and a chilik is another kind of what is a chilik? Chilik Rav Nachman Barabba Amarav Zu Sultanis. It's a kind of a fish like an anchovy, and it itself is not non-kosher. It itself is kosher, but you can't eat it. Why? Because similar fish get caught up with it. You know, they used to have this issue in America, tuna and dolphins, right? Because what happens? Now you could see a dolphin, you know, a dolphin's not kosher, and you know the tuna's kosher, right? But what's the problem? The problem is they haul them all in together, chop them all up, and you don't know what's in there, right? That's the problem, right? So that's why you have to be concerned, right? What's my old line about salmon versus tuna? Remember that one? Used to be 150 years ago, salmon was the food in America. Salmon was the regular salmon, canned salmon, you know, like not like talk today, the salmon, the fancy here they have here, but salmon was the fish. And fishermen off the shores of Maine and on the West Coast also, they found that there's a lot of tuna, but nobody would eat tuna because it wasn't known. So they put out an ad for which they would go to jail today, but in those days they didn't have those rules. It's buy tuna, doesn't turn pink in the can. That killed salmon. If you look at today, tuna, salmon, you know, like if you buy the whole salmon or they serve, you know, today it's become like a delicacy. But when we grew up, tuna was eaten. Nobody would eat. Nobody wanted to buy salmon. Canned tuna versus canned salmon. But it says buy tuna, doesn't turn pink in the can, because you assumed that they were saying something bad about the salmon. That's not, doesn't turn pink in the can, but that's what they made up. Anyway, we'll see here. By the way, you mentioned tuna. We'll talk about kinds of fish that are like tuna. Tana Rabbanan. Now we know what are the signs of a kosher fish? Fins and scales. We'll talk about that more in detail tomorrow, about the fins and the scales or the other simanim that fish have. For example, birds don't have simanim. The Torah just tells us which are the 24 birds that are non-kosher, but doesn't tell us what the simanim are. An animal, you know, a ruminant, you have to have chew its cud, you know, it has to regurgitate its food and go into the other stomach, and it has to have split hooves. So we have simanim, for the fish we have simanim. But let's say it doesn't have the simanim now. When the fish is young, it doesn't have the fins yet growing. But it's going to grow later on. Could go in sultanis. He said it's a kosher fish. Well, it's another kind of fish. Hareza mutter. Even though, in other words, it doesn't have the fins and scales now. As long as it's going to have fins and scales, that's good enough. Let's say it has fins and scales in the water, but then when you fish it out of the water, right? When you catch them, then they lose their fins and scales. Kagon, akunis, afunis, ketaf, ketas petayas, va'achsapayas, v'utnes. Utnes sounds like tuna, right? It's got all the letters in there, right? It's got the right consonants. Any case, those are kinds of kosher fish. Even though they lose their fins and scales when they come out of the water, mutter, they're allowed to. Achaz Rav B'kisri, Rav Avu announced in Caesarea that kirvei dogam, the entrails, the inner parts of the fish, v'ubrin, and the fish eggs, nichem mikolarim, you can buy them from anybody. Why? Even though you don't know, it doesn't have a hechsher. Chaskason ein ban el mi plus of aspamia. In other words, in Caesarea, they knew it was a presumption that those innards, even though you couldn't see the fish, right? We're talking about the inner parts, the intestines or whatever, the inner parts, the entrails of the fish. And the eggs, even though you can't see the fish itself, you could assume it's kosher. Why? Because they only come from those places, from Plus and Aspamia, like Spain. And they knew that was a presumption. You could buy it there because that stuff, those kind of things only came from those two places where they only had kosher fish. There were no non-kosher fish growing there. Kihada Amar Abaya, Hait Sachanta Debav Nahara. Sachanta is the kind of fish that comes from the river Debav. Sure, it's mutter, my timer. Now, why do you know it's kosher there, even though maybe you can't see the simanim? If it's because the stream of water is very strong, and a non-kosher fish, kiven, the less leichut hasir, sister doesn't have a backbone, a spine. It can't exist there. In other words, it's not strong enough to exist to withstand the strong flow of the water. We see that if that's your svara, we see that they do exist there, even in strong waters, because it's salt water. Even the less like kalbi, since it doesn't have scales. It can't stand there in a place where it's salty water. It can't exist there. We see that they do exist even in salt water. We know there's non-kosher fish in cold water in salt water. Because that kind of riverbed in that place, the riverbed of Bav Nahara, the river Dabav, it does not help the non-kosher fish to grow. In other words, the substance of the river doesn't somehow, the non-kosher fish cannot exist there. Ravina, that was maybe true once, but now that other rivers flow into that river, into Bav Nahara. What are those rivers? The Guza and the Gamda River. They flow in and they bring non-kosher fish with them. In other words, it could be that in the river, the Bav, that alone, the riverbed would not allow the non-kosher fish to grow there. But other rivers now flow in there and they bring it in. So now you have to assume that they are non-kosher. That tzachanta, even that tzachanta fish, which may itself be kosher in the right place, but if you can't tell if it has fins or scales and whatever is, you can't assume that it's kosher. Amrabai, hai chamra diyama, a sea donkey, kind of fish called a sea donkey. Shari is mutter to eat; it's kosher. Tur diyama, but the sea bull, also is mutter. The simon is tame tar tame. What's tame? What's non-kosher above on ground, on land, which is a donkey, is non-kosher. It's kosher in the water, meaning it's the sea donkey. That breed that's called the sea donkey is kosher. And what's tar, the bull, which is tar above ground on land, tame is the sea bull, is non-kosher. Again, these are things where, for example, we'll see tomorrow where maybe you can't tell if it has fins or scale. If it's got the fins and scales, that alone should be enough. Amar Avashi, Shafir Nuna, again, a lot of these words are similar to tuna, right? Shvar Nuna Shari, that kind of fish is mutter. Kodesh Nuna is Asr. If it's called Kadesh Nuna or Kadash Nuna, that's Asr. The Saman is Kodesh Hashem. Kodesh means it's holy to God. You can't eat it like an ola. It's like a carbon. So you remember that's only permitted to God, not permitted to people. So if you want to know, just as a simon to remember, Kadash Nuna, it sounds like Kodesh, you can't eat it. Ikanami, some say Kever Nuna. Kever Nuna sounds like the tuna in the grave. The siman is like the kever of goyim. Rabbi Kiva Ikla Ginzek, Rabbi Kiva went to that place called Ginzek. I see they brought some sort of a tuna fish there. It looked like a chipusha, which is a non-kosher fish, right? Didn't have the fins and scales, a non-kosher fish. It looked like that. Chafye, but he wasn't sure. Chafye bitikula. He covered it with a basket, and in the basket, chazabe. When he covered the basket, chazabe kapi. When he covered it with a basket, the fish was fighting against the basket. Fighting, was still shaking. I guess it was just, when the fish, when they come out of the water, they're still alive, and it was shaking. And as it shook, it rubbed against the basket that he put on top of it. And he saw the scales as he shook, and as he couldn't tell the scales. Sometimes the scales are so thin and so attached to the skin, you can't tell. When he saw the fish fighting against the basket, he saw the scales coming off, and he was matter, and he said, "This is a kosher fish, even though it looks like a non-kosher one." In other words, again, sometimes you can't. Fins and scales, yes, would make it kosher, but sometimes you can't tell if it has fins or scales, or sometimes you only have, let's say, a piece of the head, as we'll see, piece of the body that doesn't have the fins and scales. Ravashi Ikla the Tamduria, he went to that place. They brought him a fish. It looked like an eel, which is non-kosher. He held it up against the sun, against the sun. And he saw that there were thin scales there growing. And then he said, right, Bashari, and he said that they are kosher. Okay, fish is kosher. Ravashi Ikla Lahu Gasra. Ravashi went to a certain city. Nuna, Davidamil Shafar Nuna. it looked like shvarnuna. Shvarnuna, we said before, looks like it's mutter. Chafye b'shichle, he covered it with some sort of a basin, some sort of a vessel, chivri with a white one. And chazabe and he saw, when he covered it with a white one, he was able to discern the dark scales. For sure, he was matrid. All right. In other words, he wasn't sure if it was kosher or not. Rabbi Baruchana Ikla Akrodagma, he went to the fort Agam, that was called the fort of Agam. Kivleit Sachanta, they brought from this Sachanta, which we said before could be non-kosher. It depends that the river there did hold non-kosher ones, but he wasn't sure. In other words, first we said that Sachanta Beinar is really mutter, right? But then the problem is they bring other or similar ones in there. So he wasn't sure. Shamei lahu gavir man davi korle bati. He called it the fish. He called it the name of a non-kosher fish. Omar midika korle bata. If they call it bati, rather shmamina davar tamei is something which is bati is lashon of something which is tamei. It's got something non-kosher. So he refused to eat it. But Safra the next morning, Ayin Boy looked at it carefully. Ashkech Bey davar tamei. He found something tamei in it, meaning it was a non-kosher fish of some sort, and right, he was able to say, Kari Nafshesi, he called out about himself, he quoted the pasuk, Lo Ye'una Tzaddik Kolavan. To a tzaddik, no mishap, nothing bad will happen. In other words, he was about to eat it until he had somebody call it bati. It's a name of a non-kosher fish. And then in the morning, he looked at it carefully and he saw that ataka was not kosher, even though apparently it looked like it had fins and scales. All right, Vakoret Shel Chiltis. A chiltis is a plant that we said if you have a little piece of it, it's not kosher. What's the reason for that? My time, because when they cut this plant, they cut it with a knife. As they cut it with the goyim cut it with a knife. The knife could have been used for meat and it could be non-kosher. So what? Even though we say no, when you give it time, when you give it a taste that worsens, if it imparts a worsened taste, that's mutter. Agav churfe the chilsa, because this chilsa is very strong, it's very pungent, very strong. Machle shem naisa, it sweetens the fatness and that's coming from the knife, and therefore it's giving a good taste. That's the point. Even though the knife is a non-kosher knife, and it's imparting non-kosher meat, let's say shuman or something, some fat from the non-kosher meat, it's imparting that into the plant, and that would normally be no symptom of gamas worsening the taste. But over here, because of the pungentness, the pungentness of the plant, that sweetens the fat in the knife, and it's like giving a good taste, and therefore it's also. Okay, so this is a thing which you can't eat. You could have a no. It's not. We're not talking about yayines or anything like that. These are things that you can have a no from. You just can't eat it. Avnei Rav Levi, Rav Levi's servant. After Rav Levi died, he apparently had this Evet Kanani, and he was selling chiltasa, which we said is a problem eating it because they cut it with a non-kosher knife, and the non-kosher knife imparts the taste into the plant. And even after Rav Levi died, this his servant was selling it. Also came for Rabbi Yochanan rather. Amalei Ma'alam Esmei, can you buy from the servant? And as if it was Rav Levi, okay, we would buy from him because we made sure that it was kosher, even though you can't tell it's been cut up. We're talking about koret, like a little drop or pieces, small pieces. Can you buy from the Evet? Amalu Abdul Shachavar Hareka Chavar. The Evet of a Chavar, he was trained by his Chavar, by the Talmud Chacham, and even though the Talmud Chacham is now dead, you could assume that he's following the same rules. He bought Tcheles, Me'anshe de Beisei Rav Amram, from Rav Amram's family. Rashi says it's his wife. Now, Tcheles is a problem that they would many times try people who were a suspect would sell fake, right? Fake tchelas, right? Tchelas was very expensive because they had to get it from the chilozone, etc., and producing it was very expensive. So they would use a fake dye to make it, right? They would have an imposter, like they would use a fake tchelas and to try to sell it. So you had to know who you were buying it from, right? So So he would buy it. He used to buy Rav Huna Bar Miyudi would used to sell would buy this chelis from the wife of Rav Amram. Chassid Rav Amram himself was a pious man. He always came from Rav Yosef, and he said, "Are you allowed to? Are you allowed to buy from the wife of the deceased rabbi?" So they came for Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef didn't have an answer, didn't know. Pogabe Chanan Chayta. Chanan the tailor met the Rav Huna Bar Yumi Amalei, and he told him, you asked Rav Yosef Anya, poor Yosef Minolei. How would he know? In other words, how would he know this law? Right? He's like saying, the poor, he didn't have a real Maisa, a halacha Maisa that came before him, so he wouldn't know. But the story happened to me. The base of Rabbanah. I bought some chelas from the wife of Rabbanah, that was his name, Achvad Reb Chia bar Abba, the brother of Chia bar Abba. I gave him before Reb Nasna, and I asked Reb Nasna, can I buy from the wife, even though the rabbi's not here anymore? So Labba, he didn't know. Also, I came before Abud Magrarunya. I came before Abud. In other words, many rabbis didn't know these rules. Can you buy from the wife? That's a good question, right? Ishto Kagufa when he's alive, but now that he's dead, what do you say? So he came for Abud Magrarunya. Amali, Nafalta Liyat, you came into the right place, to my hand. In other words, I know the rule here. I'm not too many people know. Hachyam Shmuel, Eish is Chavar Ekachavar. The wife of Chavar is like the Chavar, even though he's not alive anymore. Right, the Tanur Rabbanan, Eishes Chavar Reika Chavar. The wife of a Chavar of a Talmud Chacham is like her. Avdol Shel Chavar also Reika Chavar. Chavar Shemeis, a Chavar who died. Ishto Banav B'nei Beis Aren B'chas Kasan. In other words, not only the wife while she's alive or the Eved was alive, but even after he died, his wife and his children, B'nei Beiso, all the people's house, they have a presumption of kashrus that they dealt properly, and you could buy chelis from them or buy their, in this case, the chiltasa like we had before, until they are under suspicion, until you find a reason to suspect them. In a courtyard or a store where they sell chelis properly, so you have to assume that it's kosher until, again, they didn't have ashkachas and every little thing then you had to trust people. So can you trust people when it comes to something like this? If they had a chazak of kashrus, you can assume that the chazaka goes on until they are disqualified. Tarabana. We're at the first of the widest lines on the page now. Eishes Amarshin, this is the chaver. Let's say the wife of an Amaris got married to a chaver. What do you say now? B'chein bito shel Amaris, so the daughter of Amarishin, this is the chaver. B'chein abdo shel Amarishin, the chaver, or the evet of an Amaris was sold to a chaver. Kulam tzrichim kabel divrei chavers. They all have to accept, since they weren't following the rules until now, they have to accept the rules. That what's being a chaver? Rashi says that being a chaver means eating everything b'tahara, eating the food b'tahara, right? Eating everything b'tahara, and and that they give true some maestras, all the kinds of things that a Talmud Chacham keeps, they have to accept it. In other words, even though they married the guy, just being married to the Talmud Chacham doesn't qualify them if they were previously married or under the jurisdiction of an Amaretz, right? But let's say the wife of a chaver who now the chaver died and she marries now Amaretz, or the evet of a Talmud Chacham who was sold not Amaretz, they don't have to accept now, because since they already followed in those rules, you can assume that they've done that before also. They don't have to. They have a cheskes kasher stivir Rav Meir. That's Rav Meir. However, the machlokes from Meir and Abud, we usually go like Abud. They have to accept upon themselves the rules of being a chaver, giving meiser properly, giving meisers, and eating everything b'tara. V'chein Reb Shimon Elazar Omer. And Reb Shimon Elazar used to say also that they have to accept it. And you don't assume, even though they were once in a kosher house, you can't assume that they are kosher now. There was a story with a woman, married to a chaver. She was so well versed in the rules of the Torah that she would be the one who put his tefillin on, helped him with his tefillin. Maybe he couldn't put it on himself. This is the muchas. Then afterwards, she got married to a tax collector who were known to be criminals, right? That they would just steal from people. And there she would tie his like receipts. The muchas would grab money from people and give them a receipt, so another tax collector wouldn't be able to be double taxed. But the point was that she helped the Talmud Chacham when she was married to him with mitzvahs, and she helped an Amoritz with his averis when he did it. So, a woman is influenced by her husband, and in order for her to be kosher, to have like a proper rule, you have to assume you can't assume that she's kosher. In other words, even though we have a klal that Eid Echadem Bisurin, but he has to be a kosher Eid, right? Eid Echadem Bisurin doesn't mean that a goy or an Amoritz or a person that's not religious, they can't be trusted for kashrus if they don't know anything, and they don't have a presumption of kashrus. Last line on the page. Amar Rav. Rav said the following things. 4 things. Chavis. The acronym is Chavis. We'll see what they are. Asur b'chosam echad. You can't eat it if it was transported by a goy or a person who's not trustworthy. If it only had one seal, it's got to be double sealed. What is Chavis? We'll see in a second. Champag, a different abbreviation. 4 other things. We'll see. Mutter b'chosam echad. One seal is good enough. What are the 4 things that you need 2 seals for? Chalav, milk, basar, meat, yayin, wine. We'll make sure it's yayin, nesach, and chelas. All right, we talked about yayin and chelas of being session, certainly basar. But milk is a big problem. How do you get milk? Why do you need 2 there? We'll see that. That'll be discussed in a minute. But Rav said that the 4 things, chalav, basar, and chelas, asurim, b'chosam echad. They're also if it only had 1 seal. You had to make sure it's 2 seals, double sealed. Right? B'chosam echad. Chiltas, what are the 4 that are good with one sin? Chiltas, Marias, Pas, and Kavina. These things are generally more inexpensive. Wine was considered expensive. Meat is certainly expensive. Chelos was very expensive. So those things people easily cheat on, right? So you can have like an imposter of bringing in a fake chelos, right? A non-authentic one. Right, and of course they can kosher meat was more expensive. You had to pay the shochet. Yain was expensive. So those things you need 2 seals on because people will cheat. But cheaper things like a chiltas plant or fish sauce or bread or cheese, not so expensive. If you have one seal, it's good enough. Now the next 4 lines we're going to skip now, and we're going to insert them later on after another opinion of Shmuel. Right, because it makes more sense in Shmuel. So says Rashi in the Bach. Now, so the Gemara now is Rav. Look at the 6th line on the page. We're going to come back to these other lines in a minute. But first he says, 4 things you need a double seal. 4 things you don't need a double seal. For Rav, what do you mean? For cheese, 1 seal is good enough. The guy's not going to cheat about cheese. It's too inexpensive to start making, faking the seal, taking off the seal and faking it and forging a different seal. So why about milk? Milk is not that expensive. You can always get milk from another cow or whatever, right? Or a goat. So what's the big deal? Why does he say when it comes to milk, you need a double seal? Comes to cheese, 1 seal is good enough. What's the difference? Rav Kana says no. You're right. It's not chalav. You know what the ches is for? Chatichat dag, a piece of a fish. When you don't have the fish, you can't see the pins and the scales. You get like chopped herring or chopped fish. You can't tell. Shein basim, there's no simon. So wait a minute, hainu basar. It's the same as meat. That's the kind of meat. There's fish meat and there's cow meat. What's the difference? There's hainu basar. It's a straight basar. There's 2 kinds of basar. So he's saying now when Rav gave his first simon and he said chavit, it means chatichas dag, and beis is basar, that's regular meat, yayin and chelas. Okay, that's what he says. Nice. Okay, and those things need 2. Shmuel Omer, that's Rav. Rav said, Shmuel says no. He says you don't need so many simanim. Only the last 3, and the first ones that need double seal, bait. He takes off the ches. Bait usher, right? What are they? B'chosam echad. Machag, again, he takes off from the second group. Machag, he takes out the pay, which is the bread. Okay, so in other words, he has 1 less than needs a simon. Shmuel says the bays, the last 3 that Rav said are also b'chosam echad, and machag without the pay for pas, mutar b'chosam echad. Basar, yayin, chelas. What are the 3 that need a double simon? Basar, yayin, and chelas. They asur b'chosam echad. No, 1 seal is not good enough. Morayas, chiltas, and gvina. Those 3 mutar b'chosam echad, and he leaves out pas. Now the Shmuel chatichas dag. Why doesn't he take off? Rav said that we came out the Rav when he said the ches meant the chati piece of fish. Why doesn't he also say piece of fish? Chatikas hashem bas simonim, shein bas simon that doesn't have a double simon. Hainu basar, same as meat, right? And trey gavni basar lamin. You have to say it's two different kinds of meat. Meat is meat. So therefore he says shein bas simon, right? Chatikas dag shein bas simon means shein bas shnei simonim is the same as basar. So therefore he doesn't have to mention that one. What about pas? Now we go back to the second line on the page. Now go look back up. Pas, when it comes to Shmuel left off pas from the group that said what? That you need one seal. Truth is you need one seal, but you didn't have to bother mentioning it. The Chiddush is that Chiltas, Marias, and Gvina needs a seal. Pas, you don't have to mention. What's the concern? Are you concerned that he's going to switch like Karir B'chamima? Karir means cold or stale bread for fresh bread, for warm bread. Maybe you could tell the difference. In other words, what's your concern that the guy is going to put in stale bread instead of wheat? You can obviously tell. The chiti v'sari nami made the other. If he's going to switch and put in barley bread instead of wheat bread, you could also tell, right? Iki adadi. What are you going to tell me? He's going to switch the same bread for the same bread. Since it's got one seal, it's not going to bother. In other words, it's obvious that you have one seal on it, but you don't have to tell me that it needs a seal. He's telling you, Shmuel's saying it, Chiltas and Marias and Gavina need a seal. But when it comes to bread, there's nothing to do over there. Obviously, one seal is good enough. There's no Chiddush to tell me that. Tan Rabbanan, now back to where we left off before. Tan Rabbanan. Ein lokin yamach machag b'Surya. In Surya, you don't buy those things even from a kosher, meaning from a Jewish person. You don't buy these 6 things. What are they? Lo yayin, lo marais, lo chalav. Not wine or fish sauce or milk. Below melech sal kundus. We'll talk about melech sal kundus. This is like a special fancy salt. Below chiltas, not the chiltas point. Below gmina. Element of mumcha, meaning he's got to have ashgacha. Even though you're buying it from a Jew, you got to make sure that he's a mumcha, meaning that he's an expert, that he's careful about these things. Why? Because in these places, even though they're Jewish and they themselves wouldn't eat things that are not kosher, but they're not so makbara where they buy it from. So the supplier might not have been a kosher supplier, and they don't mind selling. However, the same person who you shouldn't buy from in his store, if you were a guest in his house, mutter, you're allowed to. Because for himself, he's more careful. This is proof to Shimon Levi. Shagalo balabais the beso. If the balabais sent it to your house, meaning this is your mutter, my time balabais will shavik ater b'achli surah. The balabais is not going to leave something because mutter. He himself eats kosher, and he's not going to eat surah. But when he sends it to you, a gift, he sends to you from what he himself eats. In the store, he says not so makbet of what he has. What are these things? What are some others that melech sal kundras? So we understand. Yayin, we understand we bought it from Yinat. Be careful. Mariah is the fish sauce. Chalav, milk. Maybe you bought milk from somebody who sells non-kosher milk. Chiltas and Gvina also. Maybe he's not so careful about that. Right? We said before that Gvina's akum, right? They answered for, we brought down 5 different reasons why Gvina is usher, right? Why the cheese is usher. But even if you know that it's 100% kosher, they could have forbade it, and then later on, there were people who were moderate. But what's this business about melech sal kundras? My melech sal kundras, Rav Shmuel, melech shakol sekunde romi ochlen. It's a salt that all some say sal kundra are like the fancy choshev people. Rashi says it's the nachtomen, the professional bakers in Rome eat it. They eat that. So what's the problem with it? The Tanarabana melech sal kundras shchora, if it's dark salt, asura. Why asura? Levana muteris. If it's white salt, then it's muter. Divra meir. Rav Yehuda says the opposite. Levana asura, shchora muteris. White one is asur, and the black one is muter. Rav Yehuda ben Gamliel, Gamliel said, "Amar so they're both asur." Amar Rav what's the reason? Yochanan, the divra Amar Levana asur. The one who says the one Levana is asur. Rav Yehuda. And why? Why is it asur? The salt. What's wrong with salt? It says kirv'dagim levanim tameim muravim ba. Because they mix it with the innards of non-kosher whitefish, and therefore that's why when it's white, it's no good because it's white, the salt, because of the non-kosher whitefish. The divrei om shchora. So the one who says that the dark one is also because give them shchora tameim muravim, because they put in blackfish, the entrails of the innards of the blackfish are mixed. That's why it's black. So the one who says that whether white or black, this kind of salt is usher, because both are mixed up. They mix the innards of both black and white fish with the salt. Maybe that gives it a good taste. You can't eat it for those reasons. Amar Abavu Mishum Rav Chanina. Now he says Now, in all those cases, we said, by the way, unless you buy it from a mumcha, that means that he knew it was kosher fish. There was one elderly person, he would smear the face or the outer part of this salt with the fat of a chazer. So another reason to ask him. Now, if you look at the Mishnah, the last words in the Mishnah on Lamed Hamed Beis, where this Mishnah was talking about things which you cannot eat, even though you could have a nah. It says, Harelu, Elu, Asurin, the Ain Isurin, Asurna. In other words, the Mishnah, the beginning of the Mishnah said, Elu Dvarim, Shalav, Kachav, Masurin, the following things are Asur, but it's not Asur by nah. Chalav, Shechalba, you shouldn't eat it because the Chalav is now no concern about the Yayin Esr or anything like that. Then you saw already you can't eat it because maybe he got the milk from a pig or from a non-kosher animal, etc. Then at the end of the Mishnah repeats it. These are usher. What's the point of that ending of the Mishnah? What's the point of repeating it? To exclude what we said at the beginning of today's daf, the bottom of Lamed Chesam and Beis. Chizkiah said that if you pickled some food with in a pickling concoction, even though they sometimes put in wine in there, no concern. However, Chizkiah said if you know for sure he put in wine, then it's also eaten b'hano. In other words, you can't eat it because maybe they put in the non-kosher wine, but it's not also b'hano unless you know that they put in wine. If you know they put in the wine, then it's also b'hano. So that's what he means over it. These things are also any sort of excluding what? Excluding because that is even also b'hano. Rabbi Yochanan, what does Rabbi Yochanan come to exclude? Rabbi Yochanan says that even if you know they put wine in there, it's still mutter b'hana. So what does Rabbi Yochanan the mutter marais v'ginas beisanaiki the stomach or mayor? The Mishnah back and on Chav Testament days that talked about first the fish sauce and the gavina from beisanaiki, and Rav Meir said of that's even also b'hana. Why? Because they definitely put in wine, they put in yayin nesach into the fish sauce, and the gavina beisanaiki also was where it was the gavina was the cheese was curdled with animal rennet. That what kind of animal rennet? That were animals that were slaughtered for avodah zarah. And he says that the kogarcha mayor is chayish for a miyut, and it's not a miyut to miyut, it's a miyut. It's chayish for miyut. So according to him, it's also by no because it's mamish avodah zarah. So that's what we mean over here. That these things are also. But when we said in our Mishnah on Lamed Hamed Beis that Harel Nasurin, the Ain Surin Isra'ana, that excludes the Marias and the Gvinas Beisinaiki, which back on Chav Tes the Mishnah said according to Meir, they are also even Bahana. And the Stam Mishnah goes like Meir. That's what we mean over here. That he said these things on Lamed Hamed Beis are also that they're not also Bahana, excluding Marias and Beisinaiki, which are also by now according to Rameir back on Chav Tes Beis, and this mission is also going like Rameir on Lamed Hay. The Elu Mutar Mechil, the following things you may eat. Not only can you have an you can even eat if milk that was milked by a Goy Yisrael Ray, and Yisrael is observing him, then you have a mashgiach there, you have a Yisrael watching him. Dvash, honey you can even eat. There's no concern that they put yayin nesach in there. The Gemara will explain all these things. Duv davanios and duv davanis. In modern Hebrew, duvdavan is cherries, right? Or berries of some sort, right? Whereas here Rashi says these are clusters of grapes. Now, even though they are dripping, you don't have to be concerned that maybe the goy was made this yayin nesach, that it was menasach, the liquid that was coming out of the grapes. They don't do that. Also, the liquid that's coming out of the grapes, even though they're dripping, the balabais is not happy with that, and therefore it's not machshir the grapes from kabel tumah. If they have pickled something where people don't put in wine and chometz in there, they don't put wine and vinegar in this in the liquid that they pickled, the pickling juice, we'll call that. If they don't put in wine and chometz in that, you can even eat it. Vitar sheda trufa or herring, which is not chopped. If it's a whole herring and you know what it is, there's no problem. You can eat it. We'll talk about all these things. Vitzir sheish badaga and fish sauce or fish brine that has a kosher fish floating in it. that's also, you can eat it. But all the shechiltas, remember we said the chiltas before is a problem because if you have a piece of it, could have been cut with a non-kosher knife that was used before for something treif, like a chazer. But if you have a whole leaf, the leaf wasn't cut, and you can eat that. It's kosher. It's like a flower, a plant. Let's say rolled olives. They would take olives and roll them into a pot or some sort of a vessel and like press them that way. You have pressed olives. There's no concern there of yayin nesach, and therefore you're even allowed to eat them. You're allowed to eat them. Right, Rashi says, right? And isn't it obvious? So what's the concern there? We'll see. Rabbi Yossi Omer hashlach and asurin. If the olives are so soft that when you pick them up, the seeds come out of it, come right out. Those are usur. We'll see. Those are usur. You can't shlach and asurin. Azaysim come out of it. We'll talk tomorrow. We'll explain why. Hachagavim. What about locusts, grasshoppers? Habam and aslu. They come out of the. We're talking about the grasshoppers was a kosher species of grasshopper, but if it came from let's say from the window, meaning the slula means the basket where the guy is selling them in the front of the store, asurin, we'll see why, because they sprinkle some wine on it. When they sprinkle wine on it, maybe to give it a good smell, a good taste, they sprinkle wine on it. The wine could be yayin nesach. So that is asur, but mena heftik, if it's from the storehouse, the otsar. In other words, if it's from the back of the store where they don't sprinkle them there yet, then mutarim. He's worried he doesn't sprinkle the whole stock because he's afraid he might lose his business. But if it's from the front of the store, he usually sprinkles them like some fruit sellers, not all, but some fruit sellers sprinkle some water on the fruits to make them look fresh and they also weigh more on the scale that way, right? But they would sprinkle them with wine. Those are not, you can't eat from there. But if you took it from the stores, from the back of the store, from the bins, whatever, then it's truma. If a Kohen is selling truma, you might be suspicious. You might suspect him of selling truma as chulin, because chulin is worth more money. Why? Because it's got a bigger market. Everybody could eat chulin. They can't eat truma. So if you're a Kohen who is selling food and you suspect he might have really truma, so if it's from the front of the store, you can't buy it from him because maybe it's really truma and he's selling it as chulin. But if it's from his storehouse in the back, from the back of the store, the warehouse, then you're allowed to, because he wouldn't take a chance of ruining everything, losing all his business if he's discovered that he's selling truma as chulin. Tanina laha. This is what we saw in the Mishnah. Was actually learned in a brayso before. Tan Rabban and Yoshev Yisrael b'tzad Edu Shalav Kachavim. A Yisrael could sit next to the flock of goyim. And the goy could be milking the animal, maybe low, but no concern, right? So that's what we mean over here. These are mutar b'chila, like we saw that if a Jew is sitting there and watching the goy get the milk out, milking the animal, and he sees this from a kosher animal, it's no problem. What's the case? Either like a davar tummy better if he has no non-kosher animals in his flock, all he has, the whole farm only has kosher animals. Shit, it's obvious. What do you have to tell me that? And if he's got non-kosher animals in his stock, he's got pigs or other animals that are not kosher that you can milk. Why can you trust him? Why you trust him? Maybe he could cheat. Maybe, but when you're not looking, maybe he'll put some non-kosher milk in there. It says Lolam Dika Davar Tummy. There is, right? So the truth is there is non-kosher ones there. When the Jew is standing, he can see him. When he's standing up, he can see which animal he's milking. When he's sitting down, sleeping on the job or sitting down on a chair, he may not be able to see which animal's being milked. I think even the Yosef, since when he sits, he can't see. He might think maybe the guy will come and bring a non-kosher animal, milk him and mix up the milk together. It's probably cheaper, the non-kosher milk. Therefore, the chiddush is keeping the koi chazilei. Since when he stands up, he can see him. The guy will be afraid. In other words, it's like you could always come in. The mashgiach doesn't have to be there all the time, but if you can always open up the door and look, the guy will be afraid. So the same thing over here. Even though he's sitting and he can't see it all the time, but since if he just stands up, he can see which he's milking. You can rest assured that the guy will be afraid, and he's not going to mix up bad milk with good milk. And therefore, you can buy kosher. You can buy milk from a guy, even though he might have some non-kosher animals in his stock, right? In his flock or in his farm, he might have non-kosher ones there. But if you're standing there, or even if you're sitting there and you can't see directly, but you could always stand up and see, the guy will be afraid. But dvash. Now, what about honey? Dvash ma'ich, what's the concern? Why can you always buy honey from a guy? If it's because he's going to mix up that milk, he's going to mix it with wine. Sorry, that's going to ruin it. It's going to turn rancid if you put wine in honey. Maybe it's good because he may have cooked it, and cooking of a goy is no good. We learned the other day that if the food is either not eaten on shulchan malachim, it's not eaten on a king's at a feast, or if it's eaten raw, like an apple, and this also is eaten raw, the dvash doesn't have to be cooked. So there's no concern. If it's because of the concern that it was cooked in a pot that needs scouring, or before you clean, you need hagola, right? It's got to be scoured and rinsed out and purged of any non-kosher taste that's imparted into the vessel. Over here would only give a bad time. You got dvash, which tastes good, and you're going to put it in a pot. If it was cooked in a pot that Yidchazer, let's say, was cooked in it before, it's only going to ruin it so much. So therefore, there's no concern, and therefore you can always buy honey directly from a guy. I'm to be honest. What about grape plus even though they're dripping? Number one, there's no concern that the guy is going to use it for avodah zarah, for yayin nesach, and number two, it's not machshir for makabel tumah. For minu habotzim gas, if you're harvesting the grapes directly into the wine vat, we're going to make some wine. Shammai says that it's muchshel kabel tumah, right? That it's muchshel kabel tumah as it's dripping out. Hillel Omer lo, it's not muchshel, but odile Hillel Shammai, and Hillel rescinded, they retracted, and they remoted the Shammai that it is muchshel kabel tumah. It says hasim kaboy lamashka. There you want it for a drink. Obviously, when you want it to drink, so you're machshel kabel tumah. Hocha lo kaboy lamashka. Here you don't want it for a drink. Here you want to eat them. So you're not happy with the juice with the grape juice that oozes out of the grapes. You're not happy about that. In the case of where you want it for a drink, you're happy if it comes out. Therefore, it's machshel kabel tumah. Here, it's not machshel kabel tumah. Torah shein trufa, herring which is not chopped up. Tanaban ezri Torah shein trufa. Kol sharosh v'shed renikah. Again, we're talking here where you can't tell if it has snap here for kaskasas. You can't tell if it has fins and scales. So if you could tell by the head and the spine, the backbone, you could tell that's a kosher fish. That's good enough. So we said either the fish, the herring, that's not chopped up, even if it's not the whole herring, but it's got the head and the backbone. That's good enough. What about what do we mean by brine or fish sauce that has a fish in it? If you have one or two kilbus fish, a kosher fish floating in it, then you can tell that fish is that fish brine is okay because it's got a kosher fish in it. So Gemara says, I understand. Why do you say one or two? Hashta kilbus achas amar. If you say one fish is good enough, shari shtei kilbus b'voy, certainly two is good. So kasha kam b'psuchas kam b'stumas. If the barrel or the container is open, then you better have two fish. Two kosher fish in there. If it was sealed, one is good enough. If it's sealed, then one fish is good enough. But if it's open, you're afraid that maybe one fish just got thrown in there, and therefore you need two to make sure that the fish brine is kosher. All right, we'll pick up from here tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, from Itmar, talking more about the fish and the snapper, because kesses, the fins and scales, etc., and what other simanim might be. Have a good day. Good week.